If filmmakers want to make a profit on their movie, what do they need to understand?
So, like any product that you're designing for a commercial enterprise, you need to know that there's an audience there that wants to see what you're making or wants to buy what you're putting out. So they have to do research and they have to understand, what's working in the market, what the formula is, and then, you can try to repeat the formula of other successful films. So right now it seems to be, big names. If you want to, make a film that makes a profit, you need to get name actors. And if you can get name actors to come in and work for less than their rate, and you make a film that's less than what you normally would have to spend, then you can make a profit on it, or it can break out if you make a really good film. But if it's really about research, and there aren't a lot of films that are making profits. So you have to really study the ones that are and say, okay, well, why did that one make it, and why did this one not, and really understand that rather than just jumping in and making the film you want to make.
And forgive me, when you say big names, it can just be one name for the movie that could be enough of a draw?
Yeah, I think, I'd rather have one big name than, three kind of smaller names for a film, but it just depends. It's formulas, it's, looking, some work better domestically than internationally, some work better internationally than domestically. It depends, like, on your formula for financing it. If you need strong international pre-sales, you might have kind of a different set of names that appeal to, the big territories in Europe, from, Germany and France and Spain, or to Asia. But if you're making something where you're depending mostly on, US sales, then that name might be a different name. But, the big names for all these buyers are ones that they know have a following, have an audience, they have a track record, people understand and show up for their movies. So, when you talk with A-list, actors on down, it's just, it's kind of like a level. It's like the bigger name you get, the chart's going this way, the easier it is to sell. So, it goes, but it still has to be made for a price, because if you overpay, you can miss the market that way too. So if you make it for too much money, even with a certain name, you can still come up short. But that's where research and talking to, the buyers and the distributors ahead of time can really be helpful.
And you said previously that a big name is not, oh, that's that one that's the lead on that thing. It's the one where you don't have to describe what they look like.
Yeah, typically. I mean, there are exceptions, because there are people that blow up overnight globally now on Netflix or something, and maybe I haven't heard of them. But typically, if a filmmaker comes to me and say, oh yeah, we're getting these names, and they mention the names, if I don't instantly know who they are, I don't really consider them names. And maybe sometimes it's on me, I need to do a little research, because there have been times where someone mentions someone, I'm not sure who that is, and I go look and I'm like, okay, yeah, I just missed their last couple films and I didn't realize they were as big. But I know for a fact, like, that most of the international buyers, they are, typically they've seen, a lot of films. They're a little bit older, and so names, from the past might carry a lot heavier weight with them than a newer name, and you might be able to get the bigger name from the past at a better price than a newer name who doesn't mean as much to them. So, but it's all about research. Typically you want to put together a list for each of your key roles in your wish list, with 5 actor names, that you think would be great for the role, that also have good name value, and then you run those names past your producer's rep, or past a distributor or a foreign sales company, and say, hey, who do you like? Who's going to do the best out of this group? And then they can rank them for you and say, okay, we like this person first, this person second, down to your 5th choice if you have to go there. Or they might say, none of these names really work. Like, you should, cast it better, or consider this person for this role. So it's doing that research, and really can make a huge impact in terms of the returns they get once they're selling it.
But then if you're going to make, let's say, a romantic comedy, a Christmas film, a wedding planner sort of, relationship comedy, you don't necessarily need names. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a different model. So the low budget, Christmas movie, which I've heard now is very saturated and is not as strong as it was. There was a model. It was, you were selling these Christmas rom-coms, and maybe you'd have a little TV name or something, and there was enough to get it by. But they weren't making those for $10 million typically. These movies were made for $1 million or less a lot of times. So it was a different kind of economic model that they were following, and it worked for a long time. And since then I think it's a little bit been oversaturated, and now the market's pulling back a bit. But if you're talking about the traditional independent film models, of genre plus cast plus the budget that gives you kind of, an idea of where you're going to land, or, on paper, how well the film will do commercially. I think, you're still talking about needing to get, good names.
What budget range of movies do you usually work with?
I work from, micro budgets to, like $25,000 on up to, $30 million budgets, depending on, what I'm doing on them. Sometimes I'm just consulting or doing business affairs type work. Sometimes I'm selling or coming up with distribution plans ahead of time. Sometimes I'm repping the films afterwards. I'd say the bulk of my films, though, are indie films, probably in the $500,000 to $3 million range in terms of ones I'm specifically repping and trying to find distribution for.
So 25,000, or you said 20 or 20,000.
Yeah.
Would that be a short film, or that's actually a feature?
No, it's features, and people are making features, with the technology that are doing really well on places like Tubi, where the bar is low, I think, in terms of production quality, and people will, watch them and not complain. And, I know people that said, I've made films for $1 million and I've made film for $25,000, and they're doing the same kind of sales numbers, for me. So I'm not making the $1 million films anymore. I'm, focused on the smaller films.
And these are narratives. These are not like documentaries?
Right. Yeah. These are feature films that they're making, scripted features.
How do movies in that budget range, and I guess we should probably clarify which budget range, make their money back? So 20,000, 25,000, are they really going to make their money back?
Yeah, I think if they make something commercial, I mean, a lot of those films are doing well on fast channels and AVOD channels. So, Tubi's driving, that micro budget market, I think, right now, because there's a lot of little genre films on there that, they're finding an audience, on Tubi. And anything, if you spend more than that, you need to start talking about names and stuff. But at the micro budget level, it's really about, the story and the type of film it is. And, if you can get someone who's known, maybe from the music world or something else, it can really help. And those, some of those films are doing really well. And it's interesting too, because when you make it for that much, you don't really have to put too much in marketing behind the Tubi, releases, because it's algorithm driven. So you're basically counting on your poster and your trailer and the meta, data around your film to, find the audience on Tubi. And so you don't have to go out and spend a lot of money to market it and get people to try to show it. Hopefully, if the algorithm's doing its job, it will be showing it to your audience and finding the people who will most like your film.
And then what about past the $1 million budget range, and let's say they have a name, maybe it's not A-list? What's the chance of making your money back?
It's really hard. It's really hard because the numbers have just dropped off so much in terms of what people are paying, and internationally and as well as domestically. It's just not as competitive. So you have, the pre-sale market in Europe is soft right now. So they're not, pre-buying. So you have a lot of films that are coming to market with names that normally would have been pre-bought and not on the market. And so if you make a new film, you're coming out, you're going against, a much more crowded field in terms of the films that are available. They just haven't been buying as much. So it's a difficult market, out there for people. And so in some ways, the higher budget is almost easier if you can get real A-level names and make a film for $20 or $30 million. Not everybody can do that, but some of that, it's a little less crowded. And so if you make something really good at that level, it can support a lot of pre-sales, which can help lessen the risk for the investors. And so some ways that might be less risky or easier in some ways if you have the connections and the wherewithal to make a film like that.
So sort of, if you want to call it like the middle class independent film level, it might be harder just because it's more saturated. Maybe the name recognition isn't as much. And so it's going to be harder to make it back. But the lower, quote, income, you want to call it, or just micro budget, it might actually be easier or higher because it's less saturated?
Yeah, I think just, you don't have to count on doing a lot of different sales. If you make a film for $1 million, you've got to sell a bunch of territories, and it's got to work, in rev share situations to make that money back. So, but if you make a micro budget, if you're just banking, and maybe you have friends that have made movies and what the market is on Tubi, what a film like yours will generate, you can say, okay, well, it's going to make X amount on there, and I can make it for, half of that, at a micro budget, then I can get into profit, and do that and then hopefully repeat it and do several films that way. Whereas, a lot of people that make $1 million film, it's just, it stalls out and they don't get the sales and they don't get the money back and they can't make another film. So it's there's something to be said about the micro budgets. Not everybody, likes them. It's not, their preference, but if you're trying to make, money, you have to respond to the market and what's actually, working.
Right, and you had said maybe you have a draw. It's not like an A-list talent, but it's a musical star. Maybe someone that's in the indie music scene or something. So yeah,
I think you got to be creative. So if you have access, and you have to look at your own personal connections, because you might have someone who knows someone, and maybe it is a music star, or maybe it's an athlete or someone that can help you get a little bit higher profile people if you're making a low budget indie film. And so maybe you call on those friends to attract somebody, and you get a rap star or a singer or an athlete, or even just a famous celebrity business person or somebody to pop in. It can create a little more interest with your film and help you when it comes to market it, because maybe they put it on their social media or something and reach more people that way.
How common is it for movies not to make their money back?
Yeah, I think it's very common, unfortunately. I think, there was a graph I saw a few months ago that had the, genres and which ones, what percentage make their budgets back. And, I'm not sure of the source of the info, but it seemed pretty close to what I've seen. But, at the top in terms of what was making, their money back the most was action films. And I think even then it was maybe at the most 50%, were making their money back. And dramas was really bad. It was like 5 or 10% were making their money back. So it's very easy to lose money in it, and that's why research is so important. And you just have to know going in what the odds are as when you're making a project.
How does a right-brain filmmaker and a left-brain financier meet together in reality? Each one is coming to the table with their own hopes and ideas. Is either side fully practical? So you have a numbers person, and then you have somebody who's just purely, it's all about the art. Mm-hmm. Can they work together?
I think they can. I think when you have that, the money people who are really business and numbers oriented, and then the creative, I mean, they end up working together a lot. But I think the best partnerships are when the creative has at least a little knowledge of how that business side works. And I think, a lot of them, don't spend the time to really understand a little bit of that and, that side of the work. And then the business guy doesn't spend a little bit of time understanding the creative side. And then you have them butting heads all the time. But I think, they work together all the time. I see, there's usually, the money behind the film and then the creative, force behind the film. And, typically it's not the same person. So, it's a dance, and each one has to respect the other. And I think, the money people have to ask the right questions. The creative people have to ask the right questions as well. But I think when the creative is pitching their project, I think it's disrespectful to the money people not to at least have thought about the distribution and the financial aspects of it. It's like, going on Shark Tank and not knowing your numbers and not knowing how you're going to distribute your product. It's the same kind of thing. It's like, I'm seeking $1 million for my movie, and this is, how I'm going to spend it, and this is my distribution plan. These are the numbers, the sales estimates. Once you've done all your homework, then an investor feels really comfortable with you. But if you haven't done that, I think it's, kind of disrespectful to ask them for money, because you're asking them to bet on you.
Right, that's a great analogy, because I've seen other pitches at other places like tech days and different things, and the people that they do have sort of their numbers in line, and so that's a great analogy. So you're not going to go out there to pitch your flavored popcorn and then not have an idea who your market is and how you're going to start making money and the packaging and all these different things, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of people, they come up with creative ideas on how to do films, and they'll say, well, I want to do something different. I want to make it in black and white, or I want, the character not to speak the whole movie. And when you do those, when you make those choices, it may turn out great, and you've made this genius film, and everybody sees it, and it gets great reviews, and it does well. But a lot of times they think, oh, this is going to work, and it doesn't, and they haven't really done the research to understand the risk. And a lot of people saying, well, there's a 95% chance this is going to fail. if you're willing to take that risk, you should at least know that, so that if you make it and you know, because there's a blame game as well too. A lot of filmmakers go make the film they want to make, give it to the distributors, it doesn't make money, and they blame the distributor. And the distributor, you know, had no chance because they made a film that's very difficult to sell. So, you know, I think every filmmaker owes it to themselves to, you know, get to know a little bit about distribution. And, you know, the resources are there with things like your podcast, you know, and, you know, just talking to people who are in the business and getting advice along the way.
Right. It's almost like you were describing the artist from back in the day, but that was sort of an anomaly, and it was a beautiful film. But yeah,
Right.
I hear what you're saying. Something that's so avant-garde that most people are not going to watch it. So
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, there are a lot of you know, geniuses who want to make movies, and you know, sometimes they just have such a strong belief in their vision that it'll all work out. But unfortunately, you know, a lot of times it doesn't. Even if they do, you know, make the exact film they wanted to make, and it's just, you know, it's not in line with the market, and unfortunately, you know, they learn a tough lesson.
yeah, a lot of them are misunderstood. So
Yeah.
their vision doesn't always translate to the people that just want to, you know, have a good action film and then go home and, you know, go back on
Exactly.
social media. Yeah, I get it.
I mean, speaking of geniuses, you know, what I noticed, I've been lucky enough to go to several Picasso museums, you know, and everybody thinks, oh, Picasso's such a genius, you know, he's such a talented artist. And then, but when you go to his museum and you see how much work he did, and for each painting he did, so many times he tried 15 different versions of that painting before he landed on the final painting, which, you know, turned out to be this classic, you know, a painting. But when I saw all the work that he did and the research and the practice that he did to try to get the look that he wanted and the exact painting, it really, you know, reinforced my idea that, you know, yeah, he was an artistic genius, but he also put in the work. You know, he did his research. He knew what he had to do, and he tried a lot of different things before he actually went to, you know, make his masterpiece. So I think filmmakers can learn a lot from that too. And, you know, it's a craft, and you have to learn and practice and do all your homework and try to stack the deck as much in your favor as possible before you embark on making a film.
Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. Here is a complimentary question from our book Story Questions.